dark horse. What is a dark horse? And this has been our working definition of what a dark horse is. Here it is. A little-known person, unlikely to succeed, who ultimately accomplishes great things. Again, a little-known person, unlikely to succeed, who ultimately accomplishes great things. Last week, we started with Esther. We couldn't get through it all because it was just so much. And as we talked about, the story of Esther is summed up in one word: drama. And so we split it up. We split it up into 2 acts. Act 1 was last week, the pathway to purpose, and we'll look at that just a second, an overview, and then we'll discuss Act 2 today. So, here's an interesting tidbit if you did not hear last week or were not here last week. The book of Esther is a unique book because it is the only Bible in the book that does not say the name of God. It's not found once in the book of Esther. That's what makes it unique. Other than it's only one of 2 books named after a woman, Esther and Ruth. And so Esther is not mentioned. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. But as we started looking at last week and this week, we'll see that God's fingerprints is all over the story of Esther. Last week, Act 1, pathway to purpose. There was a purpose to the events of Esther's life, and there is a purpose to the events of your life. Sometimes you wonder, what in the world is going on? Why are these things happening? Why this all the way through our childhood, and then our adolescence, and then our teenage years, and then we get into college or the workforce and family, and all of these ebb and flows, these valleys and these mountain peaks, and you just sometimes wonder, have you ever wondered, what in the world did I go through that for? There's a purpose. There's a pathway to purpose. The purpose of Esther. Esther grew up as a Jewish refugee in the Persian Empire under King Xerxes. Because a whole group of Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem or the Promised Land or Israel, but there was, for whatever reason, a remnant that stayed in Babylon, but then they were conquered by the Persians, and it became the Persian Empire. Esther and her family went to Susa, where King Xerxes reigned his empire, from India to Ethiopia. Huge, massive empire. During their time in Susa, Esther's family dies. She becomes an orphan, which then her older cousin Mordecai brings her in and raises her. There was a purpose. There was a purpose for Esther's beauty. She was gorgeous. The Bible says that she had a beautiful figure and lovely to look at. And there was a purpose. That she was chosen from all the ladies in the empire. That's a lot of ladies. And Esther becomes queen because King Xerxes falls head over heels for Esther after kicking Queen Vesti to the curb because she wouldn't parade naked around around Xerxes' drunken buddies. And that was the reason for the beauty pageant. And that was the reason that Esther was chosen. And that was the reason why King Xerxes finds her, sees her, and is Twitter painted. And puts a crown on her. Now, there was also a purpose for God God gave Mordecai discernment to tell Esther to conceal the fact that she was Jewish and that she was related to Mordecai. Because there was a purpose that Mordecai got a job at the king's gate. There was a purpose that Mordecai, working at the king's gate, overhears two servants who were totally ticked off at the king to the point that they started making plans to assassinate him. Mordecai overhears. Mordecai then tells Esther. Esther then tells the king. And the king then kills those two servants. But nothing was done with Mordecai except it was recorded in the king's records. And there was a purpose for it being recorded in the king's records. There was a purpose for Mordecai unveiling the plot to kill the king. And there was a purpose that God put Mordecai and Esther on the pathway that he did. And there is a purpose, a pathway of purpose on the path he has put you and me on. What was the purpose for Mordecai and Esther? Simply to save the Jews, specifically from Haman the Agagite. Haman the Agagite. Now, we looked about that crazy cat last week, how he was drunk with power, and he was just a little few fries short of a Happy Meal, right? He was just a little off. I discovered this week, one of the reasons why he not only hated Mordecai, but he hated the Jews. Come to find out that Haman's great-great-grandfather, King Agag, King Saul, remember King Saul, the first king of Israel, attacks King Agag, captures King Agag, and then kills King Agag. And from that point on, the lineage of King Agag loathed and hated the Jews. You see how this puzzle piece is starting to fit? So here is Haman, who rises in the ranks, becomes prime minister, the second most powerful. He is given the signet ring of the king, which means that he can make executive orders on behalf of the king. He hates Mordecai because everybody who when he would walk down the road or the palace pathway, everybody would bow except one person, Mordecai. And everybody needed to bow in front of Haman because Haman was drunk with power and thought he deserved to be shown respect and honored. So, Haman decides to kill two birds with one stone. He decides he wants to kill Mordecai and then get revenge for his family and his country by exterminating all the Jews. So he needs King Xerxes' approval to have mass genocide. So what's he do? He goes in and he tells them about how nasty this group of people is. Doesn't clarify that they are Jews, mind you. But he just says that these groups of people don't respect you, don't respect the laws, have their own laws, and they need to be removed from your kingdom, from your empire. And oh, by the way, King, just to help the pot, to help this transition of doing this, to sweeten the pot, if you will, I'm going to give you 10,000 bags of silver, which, if it was translated into the currency of today, it would be over $100 million. I'm going to give you $100 million in your treasury so you can give me a thumbs up to get rid of the Jews. And that's when King Xerxes gives Haman his ring, his signet ring. And that means that when he sealed that decree, it set into motion the extermination of the Jews. So Mordecai hears about this decree. The decree to kill the Jews. And he weeps and then he mourns. He literally rips his clothes, puts on burlap, and mourns. Because he finds out within a year, March 7th, is the execution, mass genocide of the Jews. So he tells Esther, Esther, you got to go see the king. You got to go see the king. You got to tell him, we're going to die, including us. Oh, you're not going to be, when they find out that you're a Jew, Esther, you're not going to be exempt from this either. And then he makes that famous phrase, Esther, you were made queen for such a time as this. Now Esther knows that going to the king and unveiling who she is, who she's related to, and even more specifically, that if she goes to the king uninvited, she could be killed as soon as she walked through the door. Unless the king holds out the golden scepter to say she may come. Let's look at it. Act 2. You can write this down. Act 2. The divine reversal. So Esther gets up the courage because she realizes that she is queen for a purpose. And so she takes a risk going to see the king to plead for the life of her people. Curtains open. Divine reversal. Esther 5, starting in verse 1. On the third day of the fast, because she asked Mordecai and the whole Jewish people to fast and pray for 3 days before she went to the king. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on the royal throne facing the entrance when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner courts. Okay, here it is. It's either going to be a good thing or an end thing for Esther. So as Esther when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner courts, he welcomed her. Woo! Yes. And held out the golden scepter. I bet you that lump in her throat went down a little easier. Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." That is a big request. Verse 4. And Esther replied, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. The king turned to his attendant and said, "Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet as Esther has requested." So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. Okay. Verse 6, and while they were drinking wine, and I'm sure as they're sitting there, all the things that are going through Esther's mind. And the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want. What is your request? And I'll give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "Oh, okay. Here we go. This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask." And I'm sure she paused. "Please come with Haman tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about." What happened? What happened? Esther says, if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask. There's something that gave Esther pause to tell Xerxes her request for deliverance for herself and the Jewish nation. So she invites them to another banquet. Why didn't she just come out and say it? Was it she just chickened out? Have you ever done that? Have you're going to go and you're going to say something and you just chicken out? I don't think that's what it was. I'll put it this way. I believe it was the wrong time to do the right thing. It was the wrong time to do the right thing. Have you ever experienced that? You knew that you had to do something or say something, but when you were about to do it, you're like, there's something in you that gave you pause to say, wait. It was the right thing to do, but it was the wrong time to do it. This will make sense in just a moment. Esther, chapter 5, verse 9. This is after the banquet. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. Haman is on cloud 9. Yeah, he's walking home. He's strutting his stuff because he is now being treated the way he deserves, like royalty. Dun, 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 dun. He's just strutting it. Not only do I go to the banquet once, I've been invited to go thrice. And this means I'm going to keep moving on up. Right? He keeps walking, and then all of a sudden, everybody's bowing except he runs into who? Mordecai. poopy on his parade, right there. Mordecai standing there, and have you ever noticed when everything's going great, and then something or someone comes into your view, or something happens, and everything just goes south? He just goes home, and when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. So when he gets home, he has a pity party and tells his wife, and his wife is kind of like, dry it up, man. You're the prime minister. Just have Mordecai killed. You got the ring. You got the position. Just order these guys to build a impaling stake. Hey, let's make it 75 feet tall so everybody can see Mordecai just hanging on there. To say that you don't mess with Haman. You're not going to bow? That's what happens. Well, Haman's kind of like, hey, that sounds like a good idea. So that night, he orders to have a stake built for Mordecai. And he was so anxious that I'm sure he didn't even sleep at all last night, because he was just waiting. He was just waiting so he could get to the palace early, so he could ask the king if he could kill Mordecai. He didn't sleep, but somebody else didn't sleep. For some reason, King Xerxes has insomnia. He has insomnia. He can't sleep at all at night. He's tossing and turning. So he thought, I gotta get some sleep. What will make me fall asleep? And so he knew the one thing that would put him out quicker than anything. Board meeting minutes. So he calls his attendant, hey, bring the king's records here and read it to me so I can go to sleep. Guess what records the attendant pulled? He pulls the record of Mordecai revealing the plot of the assassination. Look at this, verse 3. What reward or recognition did we give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendant replied, nothing. Nothing has been done for him. Verse 4. I mean, he was biting out. Who's at the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. You can't, I mean, this is amazing. This is just crazy. Look at this. It gets even better. Verse 5. So the attendant replied to the king. Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, okay, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than Mawah? Pride comes before the fall. So he replied, well, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the most noble officers. And let him see the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robe and led through the city square on the king's horses. Man, he just really putting this out there. I mean, I think he's probably already thought and dreamed of this. I mean, because it's just rolling right off his tongue. Oh, yes. And have the officials shout as they go, "This is what the king does for someone who wishes to honor." Verse 10. "Excellent," the king said to Haman. "Quick, take the robe and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew." Can you imagine that? It was like in slow motion. Mordecai. I'm sure Haman's jaw was like a boo and a laugh. It's like, boom, it just drops. It's like the man he was just about to ask to impale on a stake, now he has to cart around the city and saying what he wanted to have done to him. See, Haman was drunk with power. He wanted to be king. Not only that, I think Haman wanted to be a god and to be worshipped. Then King Xerxes says, "Leave out nothing you have suggested." So that means Haman has to go walking around, leading a horse, saying, "This is who the king wants to honor, Mordecai." You talk about burning someone's buttons. I mean, it was just horrible. Verse 12, "Afterwards Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated." He's bubbling. This is a tail between your legs Prozac moment for Haman. When Haman told his wife what had happened, his wife says, "Okay, hey, since this has happened to Mordecai and is in the king's favor, this kind of changes things, put a kind of kibosh on your plans." Verse 14. "While," that is a timing word. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly, there's another timing word. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. In other words, before Haman and his wife could come up with another plan, before Haman could get out of Dodge, the king's servant quickly came to get him for the second banquet. God's name might not be in the book of Esther, but his fingerprints are all over this book, including the events and the times of the events. Amazing. So Esther, Haman, and King Xerxes are sitting around the dinner table, and again the king asks, "Okay, why are we here?" Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 3. Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask," she doesn't pause here, "I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared." Pause. Xerxes probably thinking, what in the world? What are you talking about? Remember, Mordecai told Esther, don't tell anyone that you're a Jew, and don't tell anyone you're related to me. I ask that my life and the life of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold. Who got the money? Haman. $100 million. So Jews could be killed. For my people have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet. For that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Verse 5. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? I bet right now, as Haman is sipping his wine, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. It's already been a bad day. Now it just got worse. How can this day get any worse? Verse 7. Then the king jumped to his feet in rage and went out into the palace garden. Why did he run out and mad? Because he probably just wanted to reach across there and just rip his heart out. But he got to get up because he realized he had been duped by Haman. And it was blood money for his bride, for his Twitter-pated beauty, for his queen. Verse 7, latter part. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he, Haman, fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king returned from the palace garden. And the king exclaimed, "Oh, no, you didn't! You will even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes." And as soon as, there's another timing phrase, and as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. In other words, they went ahead and covered his face before he had a chance to explain why he was falling all over Esther. He wasn't trying to seduce her or rape her. He was pleading for his life. As soon as the king said it, he's doomed. Kind of warped to say this, but isn't God amazing? I mean, the guy's going to die over this. He takes a hopeless situation, a tragedy, and creates a divine reversal for good by using a dark horse, a little-known orphan Jewish refugee who becomes queen and chooses courage. Let's look at the reversal. You can fill this out. The one reversal that happened. The plan and plot reversal. Haman plans to have Jewish genocide. And we'll see how that backfires in a moment. But also, he had a plot to kill Mordecai. And this goes sideways. What he intended to happen to Mordecai, God flipped. And it happens to Haman on his own weapon. Look at this. Verse 9. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman, hey, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 70 feet tall in the courtyard. And he intends to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Bum, bum, bum. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. And the king's anger subsided. Plan, plot, reversal. Not only did God reverse Haman's plans to kill Mordecai, it backfired on him and he became a shish kebab. God also reversed Haman's livelihood and earthly possession. You see, Haman, okay, who has $100 million just laying around extra to pay for genocide? So we know he is filthy rich. He's made deals with all these other national leaders around the world. His plunder from attacks and conquering. This cat is high in wealth and stature. Reversal. Fill this in. The economic and political reversal. As Haman is a shish kebab, verse 1 of chapter 8 says, on that same day, Haman's execution, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman. When it says property, that means everything he owned. Everything. Including his family. King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, who is Jewish. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off the signet ring. Remember the executive ring that gave Haman the ability to make decisions on behalf of the king? The king took off the signet ring which he had taken back from Haman. And who does he give it to? Mordecai, which means that Mordecai, now raised in the rank from a gate guard to prime minister, the second most powerful person in the empire. Reversal. And it gets even better for Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property, including his family. Divine reversal. Don't mess with God's kids. If that just reminds me, whom the Bible says, David says, whom shall I fear? If God is for us, who can be against us? We get so obsessed with things that go on or things that happen to us that we get so anemic in our faith about who God is and what God can do. Now remember the Persians and the Medes law? The Haman, and it was sealed that on March 7th, the Jews were going to be executed or exterminated. That law cannot be revoked. Not even the king could revoke that law. So, Mordecai's like, all is well with us, but what about the people? They're still going to die. My people are still going to die. So King Xerxes says, look what's on your finger. You can give an executive order not to remove the law, but to compete with the law. And so what does he do? Mordecai gives an executive order. All right, Jews from India to Ethiopia, every Jew in the Persian Empire, on March 7th, when they come to fight to kill you, you can fight back, defend yourselves. Not only that, but whoever tries to kill you, you can kill them and their family. So if anybody comes to kill the Jews have the right not only to go after them and kill them, then they can go to their house and kill their wives and their children and their children's children. And you see how this is going to deter some people to come and show up March 7th? Which leads to last and final reversal. You can write this down. The emotional reversal. You've had the plan and plot reversal. You've had the economic and the political reversal. And now you have the emotional reversal. Before the law of Mordecai, they knew the day that they were going to die. Look how they responded to the decree of Haman in Esther 4, verse 3. And the news of the king's decree reached all provinces. There was a great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. For a period of time of almost a year, they just circled the date on the calendar. Well, that's it, everybody. We got to get everything, all our things in order, our lives in order, because that's the day. Let's live it up. But they mourned. They were weeping. They were in burlap. Mordecai gives another law, stamps it with his signet ring, and look at their response. Their emotional reversal, verse 16 of Esther 8. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere in every province and city. Wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had great celebration and declared the public festival and holiday. Divine reversal! As the band comes up, let me close this up. I needed a story like this because I look at the landscape of our nation right now and I think, and I have moaned and groaned, and I'm like, what in the world's going to happen? And some days I think that we're do we not serve an incredible God that nothing is impossible? And where we think is night, God is preparing for the dawn. I want to encourage you with this truth. God has the final say. Turn to your neighbor and say, God has the final say. No matter what you're going through in life, the ultimate reversal, Jesus on the cross. Jesus in the tomb. Satan thought he won. Jesus paraded down in hell, grabbed keys, and put the devil right in his place, because when he walked out of that tomb Sunday morning with the power and authority of heaven, hell, and death, and sin, and everything, all power and authority belongs to Jesus now, because he has the final say. The ultimate reversal. That's the reason why we can celebrate to say there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. We all deserve hell. We are sinners. But it is through the blood and the grace and the love of God that extends to us to allow us the great reversal of redemption and salvation. If anything should give you pause to celebrate, it's that simple fact. No matter what happens on this temporary sphere, no matter what trials you're facing or the enemies that are opposing you right now, God is not worried about your situation or threatened by your enemy's schemes. If you are a child of God, trust in the fact that God has a pathway and a purpose for you. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be perfect, everything's going to be comfortable, everything is going to be all right. And there are seasons of pain, and there are seasons of joy, and there are seasons of weeping, and there are seasons of gladness. But there's purpose in every season. And God will use the events of our lives for his purposes and our benefit. He is the way maker, the promise keeper, the miracle worker. And God will take ordinary things that doesn't seem special. He'll take people who are ordinary, where the society would look at and not give a second glance to, and he will do extraordinary things. And it's all because of faith and courage, believing that it is him, through him, we can accomplish extraordinary things. So I close with, no matter where you're at, let's be a dark horse like Esther, with faith and courage, and live out Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Amen?